straight into the portfolio stuff. I have recently spent a lot of time giving people feedback on their portfolios, and also have been on like the other side of the table, right? Like hiring for multiple companies, and now also a little bit for Google. So um, one thing that people ask a lot about is whether how important a portfolio is, right, in a design process. And I would say the rule of thumb is the bigger the company or the bigger the candidate funnel for any company, the more important it is to have a portfolio, because there is no other way to have your skills sort of precede you and get your foot in the door. Portfolio does that really well, right? So even before you get an opportunity to talk to someone, a portfolio basically already ensures that you have demonstrated some sort of proficiency in your skills. So having a portfolio is very important. Whether you can spend time or not on it is a different question, right? It depends on what stage of career you are in. At some point, it sort of becomes not as relevant as the more senior you get, or the more strategic you get in your projects. It's hard to put all of that in a portfolio. So if you are at that stage of the career, the rules are different. But if you are still like a very much an IC and operating in capacity of like somebody who does things hands-on, there's definitely a lot of material you can capture in a portfolio. So there's no reason not to have one, right? It can get difficult, with the job, with an ongoing job. It's difficult to like sort of put it together. I spent about 3.5, 4 months on building mine, and this was consciously this is like a conscious effort where I took out time from my day-to-day work to actually work on this, because I had had like multiple discussions with other people who had told me that the effort you put in to designing a portfolio pays in like multiples later on, right? So it's worth putting in, let's say, whatever number of weeks you put in, right? It depends on how crazy you want to go about it. I actually ended up learning React with it, so it was a fun experience for me. But you could easily pick up like Jekyll or any like sort of a static site solution, and or even Squarespace, right? Like if you don't want to dabble into code at all, you can just pick up like a theme and run with it. Um, the problem that's I think like a good segue for us to get into good portfolio layouts, right? Because I have seen a lot of people jumping into like Squarespace and sometimes even Webflow's default themes, and they sometimes suffer with common I wouldn't call them mistakes, but like suboptimal patterns for typically for like a design portfolio, especially like a product design portfolio, and that ends up like hampering how their work shows up on their portfolio homepage. I can share my screen and show you with the portfolio open on the background. Let me know once you can see it.
Yeah, I can see it.
Yeah. So yeah, as you can see, I think the primary things that recruiter is always ensuring, right? They're not necessarily right, like trying to get too deep into your work at that point, right? So there are two kinds of audiences on your portfolio, right? One is people who just ensure that you match the quality bar and the skill bar, right, and then the experience bar. Those who are the recruiters, right? They are like looking at hundreds of portfolios every day. There is a different set of requirements that you want to address for them versus somebody who is a hiring manager, right? Somebody who literally is a designer who is looking for somebody who would end up reporting to them. So that person would look at the portfolio slightly differently, right? And then there is pure documentation work for yourself. That's also like another angle of documentation where you just like literally noting down every single detail that you worked through, right? So that's, if you can consider that like to be the superset, and then you curate information from it to create like these two public versions of it that eventually is seen by other people, right? Nobody wants to go through everything that you did, right? They just want to get a good sense of how in depth have you been in your career, and like what kind of projects have you and challenges have you worked on. That can be achieved by without having to go through 40 pages of, let's say, documentation, right? You could have that for yourself, and I do have that, right? Like that doesn't live on the portfolio; it lives separately. And then I pick and choose like what amount of uh, work I want to put on the portfolio, right? Depending on how much complexity do I want to focus on, or how how much of an impact I want to drive, right, on my portfolio. So I pick and choose based on that. So typically for the recruiter part, I would say that they look for a few. There's basically like a really good checklist that you can just go through to ensure that you are meeting all the basically necessary requirements to ensure that you have all the information available for them, right? That they don't have to go find or like try to juggle through your website to learn what they are. Yeah, so first couple of bits are like who you are and what are you doing at the moment, right? That should be like the first and foremost. A bit of information you capture literally when I open the site. That's something I should see, right? As you can see here, that's what I tried to do with my top block, right? The other one, you could potentially include links. So nobody's going to click the link immediately after knowing who you are and what you do, but you want to ensure that they see that there were links when they need to find them, right? So the links are handy, right? If they want to reach out to you, if they want to see whatever other work you have, or let's say public appearances, interviews, whatever else you have done that you want them to know, that's a good way to sort of use that space to tell them, hey, by the way, like I have done this, this, and this, and then you jump into the work, right? As you can see here, right, I tried consciously to have some amount of work appearing above the fold, right? I did not want to like just use the entire fold for telling who I am, right? That's a small bit of information can fit in a smaller space, and I already have my projects appearing, so you don't have to go anywhere, right? Like you exactly know you're looking for case studies. We all know that, right? Like recruiters look for case studies, hiring managers look for the same. So you want to ensure that you have your case studies appearing above the fold, really visible, right? There's no complex interactions, nothing. It's pure basic blocks of like screenshots. And the other thing is, I often people ask me, right, like if they have 7, 8, 9 projects, which ones should you focus on, or how do you sort of self curate? There are two things, right? One is it's important that you do self curate. I, as somebody looking at the portfolio, shouldn't have to click into each one of them to understand which ones are your most recent or the most important work, right? So if you have, let's say, 7 projects, is there a way you can bring 2 or 3 of them out and say this is my best work or this is my most recent work, and then put everything else in the underneath, right, under a different header? That sort of gives me like a good guidance on what am I supposed to click on, right? Like what portfolio case studies should I check out? I'm not checking out 7 in detail. Give me like 2 or 3 that I can go into detail. So this is the layout that I used, which kind of ensures that the 3 most important portfolio case studies I wanted them to click on are sort of the top row, right? And the other ones are underneath. So you do that bit of self curation instead of like going listing every single project. Many times I notice people putting their important projects all the way at the end, right? And I asked them why, and they said that the theme automatically puts the most recent work at the end because that's how the date sorting works in their theme. And I told them that that's unfortunate, right? You should probably flip that because that's very counterintuitive. So things like that, right? Basic mistakes. The other one is a very, very common mistake that I notice is people do not put up the name of the project up front. I have to literally, so they have like the tiles, they have tiles of projects, and then I have to hover on a tile to actually know what the project is or the name of the project or what the context was. It's very annoying. I think I've seen it so many times now that I know what to do, but and probably also the recruiters know what to do, right? But it's just annoying, and something you might just avoid by employing like a simpler tactic, right? Just put the name up front. Why does somebody need to hover, right? And the other thing is, like, you can only hover on one thing at a time. So if you have 3 projects, I can only see the name of one at a time. Instead, if you always like just expose them, then I can just read clearly what 3 projects that you've worked on, right? The fourth one was a nice tagline under every project. So you have to assume that people don't know what Ola Cabs is, what Wealthy is, what Melora is, right? You want to ensure that they understand what exactly was the amount of work that you did there. That can be achieved with one line, just a simple explainer of what you did there. Something that gets me intrigued, right? Like if I read a line, it makes me interested. Yes, I want to know what was the largest cab hailing service in India and what did you do there, right? Sounds interesting. I want to get into it. And the other one is screenshots. Screenshots I deal with in a couple of ways. One is what devices did you work on? So if it's primarily like a mobile product, you can include mobile screenshots. If it's desktop and mobile, you can do the both of them. And the other one is to use like real screenshots and front-facing screenshots. As you can see, that's the whole stick of the design community, right? Using isometric views and yeah, it's like literally you scroll through Dribbble and that's what you see, right? I don't know why people still do that on a portfolio. It's fine on Dribbble. I guess if Dribbble is not your portfolio, then it's okay to be a little more creative and have a little more fun there. Here, you're trying to achieve a goal, right? There's a clear objective here is to basically convert the person who's looking at the website. So the more front-facing you can make it, right, the larger you can make them. You should, right? If you're going with, let's say, like a 3 layout, you can just do like equal sized. I've seen some creative portfolios also do like one hero project. They will have like one 100% width just dedicated to one single project and like 2 or 3 screenshots instead of just one, and then go with the other projects underneath. That's also a good approach. If you have like one that you really want to showcase, that's a good way to do that. And yeah, I think other than that, on the main page, you don't have to like really go crazy. I put up like reach out at the end because that's, I think, a legacy component that I had from a long time ago. I also like people reaching out, so this sort of helps me if somebody scrolled down. It's not necessarily for like the recruiters. I don't think I had that when I was interviewing. I added that later. It's important that you feature your writing. If you are writing, it's good that you can show that upfront, like show that you're a clear thinker. Writing is a good evidence that you are able to think clearly, document, and write clearly. So 1 or 2 or 3 really good articles you have written, it's very beneficial if you can manage to include them here as well. Yeah, other than that, fairly lightweight, right? It's very clear what to do next, which is to basically jump into, let's say, a portfolio case study. An important thing about the detailed view of a case study is that not all the layouts, not all the text layouts are very suitable to telling a good story. And I realized that when I was starting with my own, right? I jumped through a lot of themes and I looked at a lot of other websites to see if there was anything that could support 2-column, 3-column, 4-column layouts, as I wanted to use them across like the storytelling. The reason why I wanted to go 2-column was because you can fit a lot of story with not a lot of scroll. So as you can see here, right, there is a lot of text, but I don't have to scroll much to get to it. And it's also a more pleasant reading experience because the line length is shorter. So you can actually, it's a more comfortable reading experience instead of like reading long lines. So I basically picked a very wide website width and split it into 2 to have like a 2-column layout for my text. And I'll just speak to the layout and then we get into the story. Having like a wide layout ensures that you can also have this kind of screenshots across the page, right? Where you can really go like zoom into the details and have end-to-end screenshot where you can show a lot of the intricacies of design. People actually sometimes just use one single column layout with a stacked approach where you have text, image, text, image, text, image. It's fine, but it means there's a lot of scrolling involved. There's also not a side-by-side you can do really well, which is what I tried to do at a couple of places, right? Like such as here. If you have like screenshots on the left, you want to explain what's happening in the screenshots on the right side. This is kind of hard to achieve with a single column layout. So a 2-column layout and then having the flexibility to adjust the widths ensures that you can do things like this, right? Just jump into one single interaction, explain what's happening here and what was the reason you chose to do it in the way you did, right? And like this, text, images, text, images. So you can keep the layout interesting when you have more control over it, which is what I wanted to ensure. And across the page, it's sort of coming together nicely. It makes for like a pleasant reading experience as well. If it's just top to bottom single block of text and images interleaved. It keeps breaking your pattern, and it sort of becomes not as interesting. So this was definitely like a P0 for me to come up with a layout that allowed me to be flexible, right? Not get locked into what the theme allows. So in React, I ended up creating components for every single width possible. I wanted to do up to 4 columns, and then have basically use them all on the page. As you can see, it took non-trivial amount of time to come up with those components to ensure the layout was flexible, but it was worth it. I think it. I still like it. If I had to basically tell stories of any of my recent projects, I would still use this layout, right? Because it's so flexible, and I love laying it out this way. Than
So
just
how
a
does this
simple
work
spread.
out in mobile then? Because it makes sense on a wide landscape, right?
Yeah,
And the two column is beautiful to read because the block is very easily defined. You're like going, okay, one big block of story, you read nicely and you're done. How in mobile, obviously it's going to shrink down to a single thing.
yeah, it's hard to do 2 columns in mobile, but the other thing was at least nobody's looking at a portfolio, at least not a recruiter who's going to look at your portfolio on a mobile phone. So that's definitely a lower priority. But yes, you do want it to work on a mobile. And I think I ended up stacking everything. As you can see, it's very hard to create scalable images for mobile. So what can end up happening is an image that looks great on a desktop would look very tiny on a mobile screen, and it's hard to read all of this. But again, you need to know what you're optimizing for, right? So if you're optimizing for, let's say, just converting on desktop, then, and it's also hard, right? It's hard to expect the same images to work on mobile unless you do like really crazy engineering where you selectively pick and choose images that would show up on a portfolio. But it's not a product website, so I did not put like a lot of effort into mobile. And my advice would be to not spend a lot of time there as well, because yeah, it's I don't think the benefits really outweigh the effort that it takes to really make it work on mobile. But yeah, so jumping into the storytelling, right? The amount of work we did at Ola was multifold across 3-4 different products. What the way I wanted to structure it was not by the products necessarily, but more by, let's say, the problem statements. What ended up happening was the driver app was one of the biggest challenges that we had actually worked on in Ola, and the other one was Ola Play. So out of the 4 that I worked on at Ola, and you already have the portfolio case studies outside, right? So you have to consider how much volume are you showing and how you are picking the things that you want to show. I ended up picking these 2, the driver app and Ola Play, for this particular case study, acknowledging that there was other work that we also did at Ola, but not all of that could have ended up here in a meaningful way. So what is important here is that you pick and choose what projects are portfolio worthy. Even if you, let's say, have worked on 10 things at a company, maybe not all of that is worthy of or showcases the complexities and the rigor that you normally show. Not all of the projects would even have that. So pick the 2 or 3 little things that you can actually highlight per case study and focus on those. The idea is not to show the breadth as much as it is to show the depth. You want to touch upon the breadth a little bit just to show that you actually worked on a very complex and large scale problem, but that's about it, right? That's about how much you talk about it, and then you straight away jump into like the depth of it. Now this may depend on the kind of portfolio you're building. If you're building, let's say, visual design portfolio, it's very important that you also focus more on the breadth, so the split there is more even. But if you are focusing on interaction design work, what's important is that you go into the nitty-gritties of the design elements and like your choices and stuff as much as possible. So in order to achieve that depth, you have to sort of bargain some breadth for it. So yeah, for the design app, for the driver app, we started with, let's say, the problems and what kinds of issues that the current app had. This is important because you have to assume that the people who read your portfolio don't know what Ola is or how much of a delta you created at that company. you need to show how bad something was in order to actually then showcase how good you made it. So that delta is very important, which is why you start there, right? Yes, you redesigned the driver app, but why did it need redesigning in the first place? You identified a bunch of issues, and there were some findings that you had collected. You want to speak to those. I would say, if I had to redo this, I would redo one thing differently, which would be to use a lot more bullet points. So one thing I've identified is people hate even reading long blocks of text, and it sort of becomes too much. So one thing that you can try is using a lot of bullet points. So let's say you can say old app issues and findings, and then you can have a block quote element, which is basically this kind of a breakout text element that you can use along the page. I recently I was talking to somebody just brainstorming ideas on like great portfolios, and we ended up discussing this crazy idea, not as crazy maybe, about what if you actually built an entire portfolio using just two elements, which was bullet points and breakout text elements, no paragraphs. Would that make for a more compelling reading experience? Possibly, right? So that's something that is worth exploring. I've tried to do that along the page, as you can see here, right? You have idle screen redesign. You have what is the problem? What was your approach towards solution? It's just that reading bullet points is way easier and way more fun. Everybody loves listicles, right? So lists are like a very powerful tool to use. So see if you can start that way and have that theme run across the entire page, right? That's a good way to make sure that stuff you write gets read, not and not because it's hard, but because it's easy, and it's easy to sort of go through, right? It should be
Easier to
scannable.
consume. Yeah, easier to consume, as you
Yeah,
said. Bite-sized. Yeah.
exactly. And the breakout elements are things that you typically want to highlight. And for example, if I were to not miss 5 bits of text or 5 bits of information from this case study, what are the 5 things that I absolutely should not miss reading? Like bring them out, right? Like make them really jump out across the page, so that I really understand. So for example, I would recommend that kind of a breakout element for your problem statement. Let's say if somebody is a person who has no context about your industry, somebody who doesn't know what ride hailing apps are, maybe it's nobody's like that today, but if it's a very niche product or a niche company, then it's important that you explain in simple terms what was the problem. If it is a banking app, can you summarize the problem you worked on in, let's say, one line that anybody can understand, and put that line here as a breakout element, so that I don't even have to read sections after sections. I can just understand that the problem statement made sense. The problem statement was, I was able to understand the problem statement, which sort of makes me as the reader intrigued about, oh wow, yeah, I empathize with that. How did you solve it? I am interested in seeing your solution now because I understand the problem better. So if you are going with the structure of like problem, approaches, final solution, execution, each one of those sections could actually have a breakout text element, one or more, right? Ideally one at least. So that's something I could change here, is that I don't have like a really great breakout statement for my problem statement. Um, so that's use that wisely, right? Like come up with those and then sprinkle them all over the page, because it's very nice bit of curation you can do on your own content that brings it out. So basically, yeah, we had like the old driver app to play with, and then we took lots of screenshots at the time. And I one thing I always am thankful for doing early on in my stint at Ola was take a lot of screenshots of whatever we were fixing, so that I could have the fodder to later weave into a story. Right? If you don't have the screenshots, then it's hard to basically show exactly how far you brought it, how far the experience did you bring the experience from where it used to be at. So basically, yeah, like we had screenshots, we identified the issues. This is something that I also, when I have like portfolio interviews, this particular screen is a screen where I spend a lot of time, because it's important to highlight all the things that are wrong with it, not just in terms of interactions and UI, but also in terms of how much it can end up hurting the business, right? How much such a screen can actually not be in the service of what the goal of the driver app is supposed to be. So you noodle on that a little bit and then sort of move on to basically, so you do that a little bit more. We had two more screens for like um, fulfilling the ride and what were the issues and interaction issues with those. Having a good breakout statement at the end is sort of a nice summary about what did we just talk about, right? What was the primary problem? Like making the driver reach the pickup point within the promised ETA is the biggest challenge you want to solve with the driver app. You already this way established what you are going to tackle. So this becomes very important. So if somebody's looking at your portfolio, they immediately get it, right? Like, yes, a car should reach within the promised ETA to the customer. I understand that. Anybody would understand that, even people who don't have full context, right? So you do that, and then you get into like redesign, right? You showed the problem, you summarize the problem, now you get into the redesign. Redesign doesn't start really with a solution, it starts with approaches. So you basically explain like the problem statement on this particular state, right? What's an idle screen? What kind of problems does it try to solve? Or what is the job of the idle screen? What should it achieve? And then you have certain approach towards a solution. So you can, if you put them side by side, it makes for a better reading instead of sequential where I have to like jump up and down between like, oh yeah, you were talking about this thing in the approach, but where was the problem? I have to scroll up and check again. So having them side by side is valuable that way, right? So it comes in handy, as I said, the layout for telling the story. One thing now, right, like this is a 3-year-old portfolio. So let's say now if I had to do it differently, I would do this by splitting them into core user journeys. And that's something I regret not including in my case studies more. What are the core user journeys for this particular state or this particular screen? What is it? What journeys is the screen trying to solve? And if you don't want to break the journeys by screens, you can just lay out all the journeys possible in the entire product and show which ones are you going to focus on. So there was this really interesting article I read about journey versus frequency breakdown of your entire product. That's something you should do as a designer. It's more of a product thing, but you can also do it as a designer because it's very valuable to you as well, and you have to contribute there. Is that if your product solves 10, 12, 15 different user journeys, which ones are the what's your 80-20 of your product journey breakdown? What is the user journey that the user engages in 80% of the time, roughly? Which is to say, what are the most important ones? Do some curation. So if you have 15, there would be probably 1 or 2 or 3 that are really important. All the other ones are login, sign up, changing settings, account settings, changing email preferences. Those are all not as important. The most important parts, the bread and butter of your app, is the 1 or 2 or 3 journeys. So if you break it out like that, it becomes easy for me to understand why did you focus on this flow, and by the virtue of you covering this flow, how much of the entire app have you shown me here? So if you say that I already showed you the 80% journey, it tells me that you've already shown me majority of the app or majority of your solution. Instead of saying I showed you 1 journey out of 15 journeys, that sounds very different. Like, oh, there are 14 other things that this portfolio doesn't talk about. So you want to lay it out like that, and you want to say, you want to speak to basically your reason for picking this journey and how important this journey is in the larger scheme of the product. So idle screen, so basically the driver flow, right? The flow that we solved across the page is literally 80% or 90% of the entire usage of the app, which is why we picked it. And which is why we also, even while working on this, when we were in Ola, we spent a lot of time just on this flow. Everything else was basically utilitarian. This was the one that could directly impact the business positively or negatively. So this is why this page focuses a lot on that, right? So you speak to that a little bit, you then explain the purpose of the page, you sort of go through different states about what kinds of things does a driver go through in a single day, right? Basically I sometimes spend a lot of time on the screen just talking through, right? Like explaining why the numbers are there, why the header switch is there, why is there like a big call to action and a banner there in some cases, why is that important? So you take you basically explain what kinds of things that the driver would go through. And if you're talking through the portfolio as we are doing now, you can also take the reader through like basically the various mindsets that a driver would be put through in a day-to-day life, right? It's important to just show a little bit of the context of the user at the time, because then you can make the designs make more sense. Okay, if the driver is sitting in a car, or sometimes having a chai by the roadside, and the phone is in the car, it's sometimes very hard to hear that a new ride has come on the phone, right? It's almost like you missing a call. So how did you ensure that the sound was also a factor in this? How did you ensure that visually you communicated that a ride was waiting on your phone, you needed to take an action? So you sort of explain those kinds of things through, like, let's say, incoming booking experience redesign, right? um, the previous design of the incoming booking screen versus, let's say, a new design, we mapped it to the analogy of you getting a call on your phone. So let's say if this driver app was your operating system, what would be the analogy for you getting a ride? It would be something similar to like you getting a call. You can either accept it, reject it, or if you don't act on it for a few seconds, it'll drop. So those are literally like the three mechanisms that are very analogous to how a ride operates as well. So you need to take an action. You could cancel it, or you could just ignore it, and it would be chalked off as a cancellation against you. So how do you communicate visually that you were getting a ride? And so we had this whole like motion of covering the entire screen in green, and like really focusing on where the ride request was coming from, just to give you some kind of an idea. The map probably doesn't do it justice here, but map would be way more zoomed in to tell you exactly where you're supposed to go. Hopefully you would still be able to see like a landmark name within that. The idea was that we wanted to give you enough information to get you moving as soon as possible, you the driver. So that's why we also told them the pickup location up front, not the entire address, but at least the locality. So this is something that can help me exactly gauge the distance from where I am. Oh, I'm supposed to go to the Forum Mall in Kormangla. Fine. Do I take it? Do I not take it? Does it make sense? And then also pricing and the category of the ride, right? If it's important for you to know what kind of is this more of a premium ride? Is this more of a regular ride? Do I need to prepare something in my car? So you wanted to explain all of that up front before they made a decision. So all of these things went into basically designing, how this screen should be, and then how would it transition to you fulfilling the ride, right? So we had this little animation here. I hope it shows up with reasonable fidelity. Yeah, so like we had some kind of a micro interaction where from an idle state, which looks very steady, from that you go to something that is waiting an input, right? As if you are getting a call, and it would also play a sound. So we had made a prototype in principle. We wanted to have something that could be tested, right, by with the drivers, right, in terms of how they react to the shift in the state. You have to assume that they wouldn't necessarily notice the state changing. They would only notice the endpoints of the state, the start point, which was a steady state, and the endpoint, which was the waiting call state, right? So you can safely assume that they'll ignore the entire transition and just the final state. So you have to focus more on the final state as well. So we did that, and there was some rationale behind the interaction, as I explained, right? And then this was about like then fulfilling the ride, right? The other duty management aspects of like what happens once you accept it and start moving forward. How would you think about, let's say, localization across the app? Because a lot of drivers, majority of the task force, in fact, was non-English speaking. We wanted to use simple words that they normally also use in other languages, like okay, cancel, accept, yes, no. Simple things, simple concepts that you can extend to other languages without having to sort of familiarize them with those. So those played a definitive role in that, right? And then basically duty management redesign, right? Like duty management is once you have the customer with you, how would you fulfill the duty? How would you drop them at the right location? This is quite straightforward, but that was there. And the other one was the most fun part of the entire project was carpooling. Um, Carpooling was like opening up a new business opportunity for the company at the time, and we wanted like the driver app to really be able to support as a framework the concept of carpooling really well. So if you think of like a single ride screen, we had the name of the customer at the top and basically the ride card at the bottom. If you
Status,
can
yeah.
imagine, yeah, if you can imagine this particular state being about a single customer, you can imagine 5 different screens in parallel about 5 other customers that are in the car, and you are just cycling through those and along the ride. So having this kind of an information breakdown of who's the customer, what am I supposed to do on for them. So just 2 information points on the page, and then cycling through those one by one allowed us to create this timeline concept where you can easily give like a picture of what my next action is, right, for this particular ride, and you cycle through those really easily. So we also had like I think this prototype is the one. Yes. So we had a prototype for like you swiping through um, let's say the users one by one, and possibly even taking like a premature action on one of them. Let's say somebody wants to get dropped before their turn is has arrived. You can also end their trip, which is supposed to actually be in future. This is important because you can free up your inventory. If you free up your seat in the system, the car can possibly get you more business. So these kinds of things actually end up, like really positively uptaking the business in a meaningful way. So basically, yeah, this the ride sharing was also a lot of fun to work on, and we did some user testing. Really a fun project that we did with taking a fully functional prototype, going to the drivers and like seeing them use it and like fine tuning through the details. Right, the green and red dots actually came from there. We earlier had like usage of words. We actually came up with like, I think the words are still sometimes not as understandable, and they all knew green was like you start something and red was you end something. So we just relied on like simpler, fewer things to read, more things to visually just uh, get an indication from. So these kinds of tinier changes that were born out of that. um, so yeah, that was for the driver app. This is like a sufficient amount of detail you can go through, right? And this is like a good breakdown of how in depth you want to go in discussing. And I know I skipped over a lot of details, but if you were, let's say, presenting, or if somebody is reading, this is like a good sequence to that could work. I'm not saying this is the only one, but this is the one that worked for me. So it's a good way to lay out a
Depth.
story.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good amount of depth. Yeah, and without being too crazy about the breadth, right? So if you went into this amount of depth for 5 different things, that becomes too much. It's hard to follow. It's sort of, it's too much to take in, and it's not what is it starts to get counterproductive beyond a certain point if you just keep adding more and more details. Everybody would agree that you have that because you already showed us some detail, which means you probably have more that you did not show here. Doesn't mean that you show everything. Curation is very important. Yeah, and then we had the consumer app experience redesign. I worked on a few bits on the today widget for the iPhone. Also worked on the driver card, which was like this for a long time. Got some feedback on the OTP part, added a highlight behind it, added some balance to the car, took a lot of photos. I think there was some agency that took a lot of photos for us of the car in an orthogonal sort of at an angle so that it would tell you exactly how long or short of a car were you to expect. People don't always understand sedans and hatchbacks, so it's important that you show them whether they are going to get a big car or a small car. Visually better than visually than any other way, and the name of the color, the number. So it was a lot of fun designing this particular card in detail, right? You can see like the difference before and after. There was no car details before, and then we had to like just break down like what is more important. Is you seeing the driver's photo more important, or probably the car is the first thing you should see? So all these kinds of things played a role. And yeah, even the number of the car, right, is really everything important. Can you like further curate it into like a better digital experience? um, so yeah, fun things, little tiny improvements that especially on the consumer side that ended up helping a lot. I think the app looks much different now. I don't remember what it looks like now, but I heard that it looks different.
Looks
But
very similar. honestly.
It's,
Yeah.
it still is. I think Arjun said they probably were in the process of launching the redesign. Maybe it'll change soon. But yeah, this was the consumer app, and then Ola Play,
Hmm.
right? The problem with rather not, no, I wouldn't say problem, more of a challenge with Ola Play was to explain a new form factor. If you are not typically talking about a mobile app design or a website design, but your project is of a different nature, then it's important that you noodle a little longer on that context of why did you think of like a different form factor, such as a tablet here. And again, paint a picture of take me through like a journey, right? Imagine like a Bangalore busy road and a lot of traffic. You are tired at the end of the day. You're taking a ride back home. There's a lot of noise. You have a headache, and it's just a miserable ride experience, right? Sure, you will still take the ride. It's not that you would stop taking the ride because it's still a utility, but can we make it more enjoyable, right? So this is how you lay a little bit of the context and then take them through, right? Take them through the product. This was more of a, I would say this was less of a problem versus solution approach. This was more of an opportunity to differentiate from other cab services, and how did this new product help there. So if you can, it might be very beneficial if you can explain whether something was a problem versus solution, or something was an opportunity and a product that satisfied the or grabbed the opportunity. So it's more like a vitamin versus painkiller. I would say this was very much a vitamin versus the driver app being a clear painkiller. So that way you can sort of showcase that level of thinking as well, some sort of a product thinking as well. And as you can imagine, here I went into interaction details as well as like product principles, have like a very principled approach for a new form factor design, because your existing principles don't apply. Your existing principles are sort of useful for like mobile design, but this is a new form factor and it will be used with a new interaction method, um, possibly only tried a few times around the world in a moving car. So you want to have some sort of guiding principles that help you keep the right things in mind when you're designing. So we came up with the principles and ensured that our solutions actually adhered to that kind of a structured approach. And then, yeah, showing a lot of content hierarchy and like how did you, there's a whole content side of it, right? Now, how did you lay that out? What was the navigation like? What was the player experience? What role did your phone play in the entire uh, ecosystem? We started with like a basic remote, but you could we could even extend it to, let's say, a full-fledged mobile viewing experience for when your tablet isn't working. So it could act as like a backup. So that whole thinking was there. And then basically driver device, which was another. So as you can see, I resorted to like a single column because I was also um, at that point there was too much two column, and then you can break it into a single column to just add that variety. So it's handy when done in control, right? In a flipping way, when you flip between like two columns in one column.
Yeah.
So yeah, driver app, like what were the challenges here? Like there was a whole different host of challenges, right? Drivers' phones were like tinier map devices. They used to heat up all the time because they were putting them in the sun. They had to like, we literally saw a lot of drivers put wet towels on top of the phones just so that they could keep the phone cool in the hot summer weather in India. So a lot of actual problems you end up solving through this device. So you list them and then you show like a picture of what it looks like from the back seat, right? This is how a user would see it from the back seat. So we managed to click like a lot of photos that I could then use like I've done here. And yeah, you at the end of it, you show some validation from the users, some feedback that you received from, let's say, the market. Um, if you have this section, this is definitely worth spending some amount of pixels on, showcasing how users appreciated the changes you brought. So yeah, basically that's how this thing came together.
Oh, that's so extensive. But I have some questions now.
Yes.
Like, we know that design is a team sport, right? So how much is of an importance of showing what are the kind of teammates and the team size that you worked with? How could we mention that in a project like this? Because you have addressed multiple aspects, and how do you show
Yeah.
it?
Yeah, I think I don't remember why I omitted that at this point, but now if I were to redo it today, I would definitely add your role in the project. How big of a team did you work in, and possibly the year in which this whole thing came together. So it tells me a few things, right? Is this work already outdated? Is this work still fresh? Um, uh, what was your role? So let's say you could say that you were the UX lead on it, or you were, let's say, one of the lead designers, one of the three lead designers, and these are the parts of the apps that you yourself were responsible for. So you can uh, address that in like a couple of ways. What was your role in the larger entire product? And then if you're talking about a few user journeys, then what was your role on those user journeys? Were you the sole designer on these user journeys, and then you collaborated with other designers who worked on other user journeys? That way you can lay out like a better picture of what kind of ownership did you have on this work, or what kind of collaboration did you have on this work. So yes, that is very important, but don't do it too much. Just write one or two lines, not even in lines, right? Just write like lead UX designer, team of three, team of four, something like that, and the year. And the final metadata you can add on a case study could be your final state of the final outcome of the project, which was shipped, not shipped, in production, or live, not live. Was um, you could argue both ways, right? If something did not launch, you may just omit it. You don't want to say that this did not launch upfront before they even get into this, right? So you can still do justice to the story, and at the end explain like why something did not ship or why the priority changed, whatever, right? But if it shipped, you definitely should put it up front that it shipped, because that's also speaks to like a whole another set of skills that you have to work through to get something shipped. So it can just help you more if you reflect that at the top.
Actually, you touched upon a very important point, because many a times people, or rather, just forget people, more designers do not put out their work because either it's under NDA or it has not been shipped or something, right? How do you deal with such use cases? I'm sure you have a lot of projects which are under NDA, and obviously we can't see that here, right? How do you deal and articulate them in such a that helps for everybody?
So how do I document my work that cannot be put publicly is what you asked?
That is one part of the question. The question that I actually want to understand more in this context is, yes, I have some work that is under NDA and I cannot share it with somebody, but
Mhm.
I would like to at least put the word out that this is what is going on. So how do I do that? And how do I share
Yeah.
that kind of status?
Yeah, so there is a separate type of a portfolio that I've seen around the industry that does this. That is kind of a solution to what you just described. What they do is they do not go fully into explaining the entire case study. What they do is it's a simple one pager. It's a simple one page portfolio. Still valuable because it still shows your work. What it does is, let's say if you have this kind of a layout, and instead of going into let's say these projects and then you putting the case study behind the click through, what you can do is put a big screenshot of whatever product you worked on, provided let's say you can share one screenshot, or if you even can't do that, you put the company logo or the existing company product shot there. And on the right side, you can just do like a 2 column layout. And on the right side, you can explain what you are working on in that particular company. So if it's, let's say, the checkout experience, or if it's, let's say, the shopping experience, or conversion funnel, or settings experience, anything, or new search experience for that product, you can highlight that area of ownership without actually going into much detail about what specifically are you conducting there. It is still valuable to know that, because that at least opens up a conversation versus, let's say, when you don't do anything or don't show even that. So a lot of portfolios do this really well. I have seen there was a Dropbox designer who used to have a great portfolio on exactly laid out this way. There was no click through, there is no case study. It's just about what things they solved there, improve the search experience. It could literally be like checkboxes, like a company name, one line description of what you did there, and a few checkboxes of key achievements or key accomplishments. That's also very valuable because um, sometimes no content is also a signal for you not having enough time, which means you probably are busy, which could actually work in your favor. So it depends on when is the right time for that kind of a portfolio for you. But if you are absolutely stuck with no other option, then you can still do a good job at telling, speaking to the things instead of showing them. I don't think speaking would be, I mean, you can work through like getting an approval for at least speaking about your work. Instead, if they say that you cannot show your work, you can at least speak to your work and speak to, let's say, the areas of the product that you're working on, not necessarily the solution specifically, but the areas of the product. So you can get some kind of negotiation going on and find how much you are allowed to share, and then pick that to put that on a portfolio.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you by chance remember the Dropbox portfolio that you
I
are
would,
referring to?
yeah.
Okay.
What we can do is we can, if you do write show notes, we can. I can give you some links that you can add in your show notes.
Sure,
I
yeah.
also have, since I'm sharing my screen,
Yes.
a good friend of mine, Brian, has shared a lot of really good portfolios on his website. And at one point, I used to maintain a list of my own. I stopped doing that because many of those people actually took the portfolios offline or they no longer maintain them. So I just deleted my list, or maybe it's still there, but it's not updated. Um, but then recently, Brian created this really good list. It has tons of portfolios, as you can see here, that are really, really helpful. And I think a few of these are also with not as in-depth examples, but like good examples of what you can do when you can't share much. So I would highly recommend like people going through these, and see how other people have done this. These are some really good examples. Many of these were also on my list, so I can tell that Brian has worked hard in collecting these. So yeah, something to something to keep in mind.
Yeah, that's actually a lovely list. I will add it in the show notes so that people can refer it later. Definitely.
Yeah.
This is amazing. And I know that you've taken a long time to write a portfolio. So I was just
Mhm.
wondering, if you are in a rush, right? We are interviewing for jobs and all of those things. So at that point, would you just create a simple portfolio? Is there like a short version, medium version, long version? How would you go about that? If you have an example, it will be great.
I can. A great question, because fortunately we now have tools to address this issue, right? I was actually yesterday thinking about just removing this entire portfolio and moving it to Google Doc. A Google Doc can actually be a portfolio as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I have seen many people in companies where they don't have time to actually build a website and maintain a website and build a CMS and understand and all that, or even get a domain and stuff. Just don't do any of that and just put everything into, let's say, a slide deck, and make one slide deck per project, and just collect all those links in a Google Doc. That is also more than sufficient. The less effort I have to go through to understand your work, the better it is. So I don't even think that a website is necessary. And I was legit tempted to come up with like a simple Google Doc and just list all the projects. I'm actually doing that for my internal work, right? I maintain an internal portfolio where I maintain a Google Doc with the projects and links to the relevant decks. The decks speak about the project in more detail, but the doc does a good job of listing the coverage. And then under each link in that doc, I can add like accomplishments, as I said, right? You can just add like, did this, did that, achieved this, moved numbers, whatever, moved some metrics, and that that's a great portfolio. If somebody wants to dive deeper, they can always click through and get to the get to the slide deck and go through the project. What it can help you with is, because if you are supposed to present your work later on in an interview process, you if you already have it in a slide format, it becomes very easy to just take somebody through that work, because it's already in a presentation form. The other benefit is you can easily share Google Docs in a private way. So it's not that you have to even worry about your work leaking publicly, or somebody, if you put it on a website and hide it behind a password, which is a lot of work and all that. Instead, Google Docs allows you to just share it with selected people. And if you do want to make it public, you can also do that. You can just make a Google Doc public and just share out the link. People can visit it. And it's a very lightweight way. It's free. It's very, very easy to edit. There's no Git involved. There's no code involved. You can just type new stuff. So it's very easy to update as well, which is what I like about it now. Having no time to focus on, let's say, the layout and stuff, I would probably just pull off a dumb, stupid Google Doc and just list all the links there and be done with it. That's it. It doesn't mean you sacrifice on the show and showcasing your work. It just means you become more efficient and cut out all the chrome from it, right? Just focus on the basics, text and links. That's all you need.
Yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned metrics and numbers. I almost forgot about that in the Ola thing. How much can you showcase metrics? And as designers, sometimes we're not even privy to these numbers, right? So how do you actually get that information and show that, hey, my design had an impact of 60x, or I'm just giving a number, but how do we show it as a designer in a portfolio?
Yeah, so one thing I did at Ola was chase down product managers to get access to dashboards, or even use whatever access they had to sit with them and understand what impact we were having or our work was having. In Google, it's slightly different because it's a lot more number focused company than, let's say, a startup typically is, or historically, bigger companies tend to be more metric focused than smaller companies, simply because the amount of metrics they have, right? So it depends on the company you are in, but even whatever company you are in, it still is possible. So you would still be tracking some numbers. You would still have some way of measuring success. You can partner with your PM very effectively to understand what his or her measure for success was, and then reflect that in your work by saying, this was our measure of success in when we started the project, and by the end, this is how we deemed it as successful, or as a failed project. Any way it could be, but as long as you have something to speak to, I think that is very useful. And it's almost as if having it is more useful than it being perfect. If you have it, having something is useful than it being perfect, because you can at least speak to it, right? Hey, these were our measures for success, but then the metrics changed, or we couldn't measure it effectively. These are all not unknown problems to people who you're talking to, so they would empathize. So as long as you have something to talk about. But if you don't have any of that, and you also don't know when you are asked verbally, then that's a problem. So keep it in your back pocket, as we say it. You probably don't need to put it or shout about it up front, but always have it handy when you need to speak to it. So back pocket could also mean just shove it at the bottom of your portfolio, hide it, or put it as a paragraph at the end, whatever. Keep it so that you can refer to it, basically. I don't think it would show up necessarily in a recruiter looking at the portfolio, but it is very likely it could turn up in a verbal interview when you're presenting your work.
Interviews actually remind me, how do we actually weigh out opportunities and all of those? But even before we go there, right, we all want to go to our ideal companies, right? That is one level. The other level is just figuring out what to work with. So I was wondering, can you give me some opinions and thoughts on those aspects as well?
Yeah, I think at some point, when you're working in a job, you just know that you're sort of hitting the ceiling of your interest and your motivation to work on the same problems, which means you probably are, let's say, burned out by the same problems, or you're burned out by the culture, or you're burned out by, let's say, the processes at the place. That's when you know it's time to move on, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's important to acknowledge that you have recognized that you want to move on, and then lay out the next steps, right? For me, I actually was looking at a portfolio of companies at the time, and when I decided to move on from Ola, I was looking at 5 or 6 companies at the time, and had started interview processes with all of them. How I did that was I just put them up in like a spreadsheet, and I have my own sort of very basic structure of like tracking, like let's say who do I talk to, what are the common jobs that are open there, and what are the people that I know in my second degree network or third degree network, right? Just so that if let's say I want to reach out to somebody directly, I want to have them on the list, or I want to have some names, right? So that all of that speaks to like the research you do prior to applying anywhere, and you throw that into like a spreadsheet and then work from there. Work out like a timeline, right? How long does a typical company, all of those take in hiring, right? There are signals available online that you can check. There are Glassdoor ratings that you can check online to see how good of a culture they have, or a certain company has over the other. So that gives you your priority list about which companies are your P0s and which ones are your P1s and P2s. So then you can work from top to bottom in that list. Prioritize in applying to your P0s first with the utmost integrity and like highest fidelity of your work, however high you can go. And basically design your portfolio in service of those 2 companies or 3 companies, whatever your P0s are, and go from there basically. And once you start a conversation, there are a ton of delays involved, right? People don't reply on time. Things fall through cracks. You want to ensure that you are following up. You're following the 2-7-14 rule, right? Follow up after 2 days, follow up after 7, and follow up after 14. Create like your own system so that you don't end up not following up, or you don't end up failing from your end. That yeah, that's like how I approached it. Putting a little bit of structure helped me like make sense of everything a lot more, basically, instead of just winging it, just relying on my inbox to tell me what to do next. That's probably not a wise idea if you are juggling through, let's say, 4 or 5 or 6 different companies at the same time.
Okay, that makes sense. So when you say P0 companies, right, you mean like these are the companies that I want to target and go, right? Like, for example, everybody, so this is a very common trick. Everybody wants to go to, hey, say, I want to go to these top 4 companies, this Google or Uber or, any of Airbnb, and they have all of this. But it also depends on where you are from. So how did you approach it that way as well? So that, you saw that, okay, I have a chance, maybe I don't have a chance. How did that go?
Yeah, I think this is where mentors come in, right? This is where mentors from your own field can help you a lot in assessing your, giving you that reality check. I think the reality check is important because it can help you not get too disappointed when you are punching above your weight, sometimes too much. And where what actual calibration do you set on? So it's important to talk to, let's say, somebody who's a senior designer in your current company. If you are really good friends with them, comfortable talking to them, then you can just pick that conversation with them, or somebody in the industry that you follow who is at that company, right? I did that a lot. I reached out to designers who were in the companies that I wanted to end up in one day, talk to them, show them my work, and get like a 1 hour call with them to understand how that company sees designers when they recruit, and where does my work fall on the spectrum of something that is acceptable there or something that doesn't meet the bar. So these are the 2 ways I would say you can approach that, which would give you a fair bit of an idea of what your P0s can be, not your what your P0s are, but what they can be, right? Everybody would put their best companies on the P0s, but maybe that's not, you're not there yet, which is perfectly fine. It just means that there are some extra steps involved before you end up moving to that company. So know where you are, through like peer feedback, or through mentors, and then go from there, basically.
That makes sense. So when I actually am trying to frame this question in a better way. The thing is, when you are starting out saying that, okay, this is my mentors and all of this, when you started preparing for interviews, did you do mock interviews, and did you apply in context? How did you go about this process?
I I have been somebody who has never done mock stuff. I should have. I have been the guy who would basically turn up to a test having no prior test experience or no timing preparation and all of that. I don't even prepare for my portfolio presentations where timing is very important. You have to finish it in 45 minutes. I just don't like it because I think it's a personality thing. I don't think it's because I'm confident or anything. I still have my doubts, but I just don't see any value in um, preparing beforehand, um, thinking it would help me in any ways when I really have to then act on my feet. So I rather just don't practice and see how it goes. And it's been fine. I think it doesn't help everywhere. And I have seen sometimes it not helping me, or sometimes so I see it both ways, right? If you are the type of person who really can benefit from practice, and you would know it, right? You would know it because this is not the first time you're put through a test. So if you are that kind of a person, yes, absolutely practice, do a mock round, do a timing check on your presentation. I don't ever do that for myself. It's just something that I'm not comfortable doing or never got into a habit of doing. Even the design up talk that I did, I had never practiced. I had no no rehearsals done. I did not even turn up to Jay's invitation for rehearsing on stage. I said I don't want to do it. I'll just come and see how it goes. So yeah, it's a personality thing. So if you are that type of person, absolutely do that. I think it's important that you keep keep up what you have been doing. Don't experiment at this point, is what I would say.
I don't believe that you did.
I think-
I don't believe that, but I can understand why as well. So,
I mean, I had a few things that I wanted to say, but like there was no, I didn't say the entire thing once. Like, hey, let's do a round in front of the mirror and see how it looks. There's saying things that I wanted to say, but
this is groundbreaking.
I mean, at some point, talking a lot becomes so much a part of the job that talking comes naturally to you. So it no longer is something that you need to you feel the need to practice. But yes, everybody can benefit from practice. I'm not saying that. I think everybody should practice. It's just that some people find it very hard to do it.
Okay, I would trust you on this, and then we will move to the next one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was wondering if you would, if you were, as you're now hiring designers, right, and you would be
Mhm.
giving certain interviews or certain exercises to them, how would you actually go through it? Or, how did you go through these exercises that were given to you when you were applying for these jobs?
Yeah. A couple of things, right? Ask a lot of questions. Typically, design exercises on your feet are meant to be a conversation. They're not meant to be Q&A. So you're not necessarily, they posed a question, you are answering that. Don't jump to designing straight away. Even if you're doing, let's say, a whiteboard exercise, don't immediately get up and start like making mocks on the screen, on the whiteboard, right? It's counterintuitive because it's rather counterproductive, because they they do judge you on how quickly you get into solutioning versus how open you are to just discussing the problem more. So asking a bunch of questions, working through like the details of what their problem statement meant. I've seen this. They deliberately keep problem statements vague and loosely defined. There's a reason. They want you to define it with them. They want you to discuss it out with them. They want you to make the details concrete as you are talking with them. So if you just start assuming that the details are already subconsciously communicated and just assume and start putting pen to paper, that is a negative. So you would want to just wait and talk it out. That's like the biggest advice, right? And then naturally, as you uh, cultivate the approach where you are designing with them, you're co-designing, and they are sort of your on your side, you would approach it very differently, right? You would discuss things, you would put something on the screen, and then like again criticize it yourself. So you're literally like creating, criticizing constantly, while they are also nudging you in the right direction where needed. So there's like a conversation and self-critique involved. Self-critique is very important. With it's not about you spending those 15 minutes or 30 minutes coming up with a great solution, and there is no time left for conversation. That's a bad interview or a bad exercise. A good exercise is where you design, let's say, 4 or 5 screens, whatever, if there are screens. I'm just taking a dumb example, but you take like 4 or 5 screens, you design them, but you arrive at those screens probably in the 90th percentile of your time. At the 90, like literally in the, let's say if it's a 30-minute presentation, 25th minute is when you want to be in that position where you do have something to look at. Sometimes like you end up having such a great conversation that you don't even finish your designs. It's not even needed, right? Because it's apparent that you gave them the right set of things that they were looking for to assess you, right? So it's very possible that you can do that even without making a lot of mocks on the whiteboard. So know that the mocks on the whiteboard are probably like 20% of the entire thing. The rest 80% is how do you collaborate with a designer. So see that as a collaboration exercise, not as a problem statement and you are giving a solution kind of an approach.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was wondering if when you actually mentioned that, hey, the last 10 or 5% is basically the UI and the mocks like that. So do you have a go-to method for these kind of approaches, or do you generally just start off with your usual design process and all of them?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on like the problem statement, but sometimes, let's say this some random exercise that comes up a lot is design so and so for young children or kids, right? And people say, okay, yes, let me pick up like a assume like a phone and start designing, and here's a screen, like it's for the kids. So like, yes, if the buttons would be big, they'll be colorful, they'll be cheerful. But I mean, you already made a very big choice which pigeonholes you into a certain approach, which is that you decided to make an app. Maybe there was a conversation even before that. So always, what is the first thought that comes to your mind when the person asks you that interview question? The moment you have that thought, see if there are any assumptions in that thought itself. Like if your response to that kind of a question is, okay, so that's going to be an app. Okay, so I'm going to design with like fresh color scheme, bright colors, pastel colors. No, you already made an assumption that it needs to be an app. Like stop there, right? How basic can you be in your assumptions so that you are left with no assumptions, basically? So how basic of a thought can you have in response to that kind of a question, which is, why do kids need an app? First question is like that, right? Why do kids have that problem? So you start like understanding the problem, start defining that problem with them, and then progressively you say, okay, so then maybe a digital solution is not useful, or let's say a digital use solution is the only way. Okay, fine, either way you can argue either way depending on what the exact problem is, but then progressively you can uncover like details, and then you show like your solution in that little bit of time, because you would have all these conversations, you would solidify the problem, you would anyways not be left with a crazy amount of solutioning time, which is good because you're not showing mocks on a whiteboard as the judging hallmark of your skills, because you already did that in your portfolio. This is about you approaching a certain problem. So this is actually evaluating a very different skill, and we have like a completely different idea of how to approach it. So I always I have learned having gone through these a bunch of times. So this is what I would say how you would approach it.
Got it. Yeah. Overall, it actually makes sense. Do you have any documentation that I could share, or is this documentation enough?
On the whiteboard exercises?
Yeah.
There are some really good articles. I think Facebook team has shared a few on Medium about approaching a really good whiteboard exercise and how you succeed at it. I think and then there is also some companies also do like design crits. So where you have to like pick up an app or a product and then critique the app and then put your touch to it, right? Like how would you design it differently? So these two are the two main principal methods that I've seen in companies, and I think there are some Medium articles from Facebook that go really in depth about how to approach this. We can probably add them in the notes.
Yeah, I'll add them. I'll take it from you, and I'll
Yeah.
definitely add them. Yes, that'd be amazing. Now, whiteboard and all typical things. How do you deal with in-person interviews, right? You sit to the
Yeah.
manager, you talk about culture. How does that happen?
Yeah. So again, I think it's I've had some really good conversations with people who are open to, let's say, having like an honest and friendly conversation, right? The It depends on what stage of the interview process do you encounter that kind of a conversation. If your portfolio has been reviewed, if your exercise is done, right, at this point, you're probably only discussing with a product manager or a hiring or a senior designer from the company. In that case, it's you want to know more about the company as much as they want to know about you. What they want to know about you, you can potentially look at this as half and half split, and they would definitely tell you that you have time for asking questions, so you should use that wisely. Them asking you stuff probably would be a lot of the more of the same, right? Has your career panned out the way it has? What kind of challenges are you looking for? What are you most excited about? But what you want to know from them is basically the culture of the company, right? The growth trajectory that is possible within the company. How does the company value, let's say, initiatives? People who are actually used to sort of going above and beyond, let's say, their line of duty, and be people who want to hustle more, right? How does the company reward them? How does the company, let's say, look at the product roadmap, or how far ahead of time does the company plan out things? How much time do designers get in designing? All these things that you actually did not like about your previous job, and which is why you are actually trying to move on. You want to ensure them now, having known better, how those would be in your next opportunity, right? So all these things about like user research, right? Does the company do a lot of user research? Does the company understand their users? Does the company invest a lot in design? How much time do designers get? How much time does the company focus on finishing and adding finesse to the products? So create a list for yourself, right? The things that bothered you the most in your previous company, you could potentially identify those early in every opportunity from that point onwards, and you don't want to miss that. So that conversation you have with a senior designer is an opportunity for you to get a sense of how things are in that company. And I would say treat that seriously. Instead of coming up with like fluff questions, go very specific. And the more specific you are, the more sort of prepared you come off, and the better answers you can get. Because it's hard to um, it's hard to not give useful answers to specific questions, right? You can't duck out of a very specific question. So the more specific you are, the clearer picture you can paint about what life is like at that company. And this is important because not a lot of companies document their culture publicly. The companies who document their culture publicly, you can probably just read and get a sense of how things are there. All the big companies do, but many startups don't. So instead of when you have nothing to rely on, the only objective data point you have is probably from the person who you can ask questions to. So take that seriously. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned that I create a list and the specificity of the whole thing, right? Now, when we say culture, it's a broad gamut, like a broad
Yeah.
gamut of questions that come in. So can you give me an example of the specificity that you were mentioning about, so that I can understand it a little more better?
Yeah, I can. I have one question that used to be on my list for a while, which was when was the last time you as a team produced an unsuccessful project, basically, and how did you create a retrospective on it, and how was it received in terms of affecting everybody who was involved? This is my question, which sort of uncovers a few things. What kinds of practices or processes does the company have in their arsenal to actually handle failures? how is feedback propagated, let's say from the retrospective down to everybody who was involved in the project, and then how do you come back from that, right? How do you come back from that from that kind of a setback? So that used to be my question to assess the culture a little bit. You could have more specific questions about design processes, right? Typical example could be, do you all take a design cycles into account, just like how you take end cycles into account? How do you measure or account for designer time in a product process, right? So in building a product. So that could tell you about whether designers are always pressed for time in against like very tight deadlines, and which tells you that design is sort of not a very important function that is seen as bringing value to the product. It is almost seen as a utility that just needs to happen before you move forward with the next step. So you can sort of tease out like specific parts of the process and just focus on those and get like ask more questions there to understand you know yeah, like what are the depths of things that don't on the surface you get to often know about.
Yeah, that makes sense, because I'm now able to clearly see the difference between an overall question and like a depth-based question, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
Now, if I am going for a depth-based question, is it right to only ask the one person that I have contact with, or should I go speak to other teammates and understand the whole scenario? How would that go?
Yeah, I mean, you would get a chance to speak to more people. You would in a fairly elaborate hiring process, you get a chance to speak to a researcher, product manager, senior designer, engineer, front-end engineer, UX prototypers, all kinds of folks. And one thing you could do is ask the same questions to all of them to get like a good collaborative filtering going for yourself, to understand like how every one of them sees the organization as. And if you ask the questions the right way, you can actually understand the power center really well, like which function is like the more dominant one in the organization, which function sort of ends up deciding like the priorities and the roadmap and things like that. So it's a fun exercise. Like it doesn't it's not something you would be able to crack from day one, but if you do it really well, or if you think about it really hard with and go with the right questions for all the functions, then you can get a good sense of the way the organization is structured, and how the different functions are unequal. They definitely are unequal. Not all of the functions are treated the same way in product and design, and you want to understand who's tugging who, and like who's deciding and who's basically reacting. So you want to get first-hand idea of let's say like a rough estimation of what that picture looks like, just so that you don't want to go in completely uninformed.
Yeah, that makes sense. We've done all rounds of interview and all of them. How do you close these interviews? And you close it with a good feeling. How do you do it?
Yeah, I sometimes leave like a couple of minutes for friendly chatter. Just basically water cooler conversations, if you can have them, depending on how the interview went. Sometimes you had a lot of fun, and then you can just end it on a high note, right? But the good thing is, like after the interview ends, you do have an opportunity to actually still make a mark by sounding professional. I think that there can be follow-up emails about, hey, it was fun, like nice talking to you, thank you for taking the time, and then you can end it with a note saying, I am looking forward to hearing back from you, whatever, right? That sort of closes like the entire conversation that you just had, and opens up, let's say, like you put the ball in their court, right, that they are supposed to respond now. So you want to be like very clear that way, that you are waiting on an answer. I mean, in big companies, like recruiters typically are doing all of this anyways, because they have like a very big structure around it, very tight structure around like handling candidates. So you wouldn't necessarily need to do that, but even then, you can potentially ask for like their email to, let's say, hey, I would love to keep in touch, however this pans out, so that you can at least have like somebody who you, if you want to reach out in future, you at least now have like a contact who you actually met in person. So that's also something you can do depending on how it went. But yeah, generally like closing the conversation with a nice little short email is always a good idea. Yeah.
Closing the conversation is one part, and you of course put the ball in their court. Now if you want to hear back from them, and what happens after there's a long pause or something like that, how do you
Yeah.
deal with those situations?
Yeah, I set reminders immediately after the interview is done. I set reminders for myself for 2, 7, and 14, basically 2 days for 7 days and 2 weeks. So I set reminders to follow up in case I don't hear from them. And once I've reminded them 3 times, it's sort of enough, right? Like you need not send any more emails. It probably is that they don't have anything to respond, or it just you probably didn't make it, or the company wasn't good that they didn't want to respond. It could be anything. But your due diligence, things in your control, are that you follow up at that kind of a cadence to ensure that you are waiting on them for a response. So that's how I would make sure that I don't end up not reminding them in case I don't get a reply. You want to do that because if you are handling with multiple companies, juggling with multiple companies at a time, you wouldn't know when you talk to who, and it's hard to remember. So you just put reminders for yourself to make sure you follow up.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, what if you have received a bad news and you're like, hey, we're disqualified, and how do you deal with it? Like, I know there's a nice way to close it. What was
Yeah,
your go-to method?
yeah. I think. I mean, I've had a lot of rejections even before Google happened, right? Um, that's the power of having a sheet and having multiple opportunities still open, right? Because if you only focus on one and that doesn't work out, you have sequentialized the whole process, which means you weren't focusing on anybody else that entire time. And then it all came to nothing. So this is exactly why I had that framework of focusing on multiple opportunities at a time. So you hedge your time and hedge your bets, right? And multiply your efforts. If you made a portfolio, doesn't take that much more of a time or an effort to apply to more than one companies. So if you have that kind of a rejection, I would say you still, let's say, write a nice note and end it. There's not much you can do actually at that point. You can say that like you can see if it is actually just a timing issue. You can ask that question in that rejection response to that rejection email, saying whether they would like to reconnect, let's say 6 months down the line or a year down the line. So you at least have a channel of communication open in case you want to reach out to them in future. But that, yeah, that's about it. And other than that, you just basically move on for that point. Yeah.
That makes sense. Now, the only question that I ask is like, in terms of this is like the final question that I like. You've received an offer. How do you say yes? What parameters will make sure that okay, this is the yes for me and this is the no for me? How do you accept these things?
Yeah. So even without you having to make a disclosure to the person who you are negotiating with, know a number that would make you say yes. Always have a number in mind, and that way you know basically how you are valuing your skills and whether the company also values it at roughly the same level, or is it like you want to gauge how far off their number is, right? Is it within the ballpark? So it's even more important to come up with a range, right? How low is it acceptable for you to go in order to make the most of this opportunity? And then what is your ideal scenario? So if you have a range in mind, and also companies have ranges in mind, they don't have like specific numbers, they're always working with ranges. Then you can actually calibrate what end of the range do their offer falls on, and then you can make the necessary trade-offs. The trade-offs could be about what are the perks are they offering, what other let's say salary is one part, right? You on top of that, there are many other aspects that you can evaluate an opportunity on. Basically, the people you get to work with, the cost of the opportunity, like is it going to be more difficult or less difficult getting in the company later? Is now like a very like sort of have you approached the company at the right time, right? Like, should you take this opportunity and not let this go? Because in future it will be more difficult. Or let's say the team that is hiring right now, is it one of a kind that probably doesn't hire often, which means you want to like not miss out on the opportunity, even if it means you like sacrifice on a couple of other things. So you want to know like what is your assessment of all those factors, right? And then comes all the perks, right? The perks are, as I said, is the team really great? Do they not hire often, which means the opportunity is very rare and you have been selected for it, so should you value it differently? Then does the company sponsor a lot of learning? Does the company sort of promote a lot of promote culture of like you improving yourself, right? Does the company invest in you as well, right? In your betterment, in the quality of life improvement for you? Does the company, let's say, send you on conferences? Does the company have budget for like your well-being? All kinds of things that can, these all play a huge role in evaluating opportunities. Sometimes like for a certain amount of delta in two different offer letters, we end up choosing the one with more money, but the one with slightly less money could have actually had better perks that you value over a longer term. So think about that. And then there's this nice concept called BATNA, which is basically best alternative to your negotiation agreement, right? What is your best alternative in case, let's say, the agreement doesn't happen, right? And what is your worst alternative in case the agreement doesn't happen? Is your worst alternative that you have nothing else lined up? Okay, then that's something you should keep in mind. And the best alternative is that probably you get to work on yourself and you get to move on to a better company. Fair enough. So that's your decision right there, right? So this is how I would evaluate uh, all of that put together, right? A lot of people purely judge an opportunity based on salaries, which is a very myopic view of what an opportunity can actually offer. Like things like, do I get to work with a CEO? Do I get to work directly with the leadership? Do I have a great opportunity to grow into a leadership role myself, right? Sometimes people look for that kind of a thing versus picking something that just paid more. I mean, something that just paid more could be a very valid reason at a certain time in your career, but progressively you should look at more than that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Closing notes, would you like to add any?
No, yeah, I think just keep hustling, like I think the community and the field of design is very rewarding if you have the right intentions in mind, and if you are honest, if you do if you work really hard and are true to yourself, true to the craft, and do not want to employ any of the bad tactics to grow fast in your career. I think that the domain is very rewarding. It basically gives like a great career to anybody who wants to serve the field honestly. So I would say just keep at it and work hard, and always talk to like other people in the industry, like always be open to more perspectives, and don't just work on your own and work in an isolated corner. Participate in conversations, make friends from the field and like understand what they are going through. That all of this would help you develop like a good perspective on how you should look at your career. And above all, have a mentor if you really can, right? Like almost chase a mentor, yeah, right? Like run after somebody until they'll agree to being a mentor to you. Only mean it as a joke. Don't stalk people, but yeah, I mean, if you're lucky to find a mentor, I think that can be a game changer for your career. It's been for me, so I can definitely speak to the impact it can have.
That makes